Hello and welcome to Bridgecast. We are super excited that you're here joining us. Today we are joined by Jenna Dobyns, who is a good friend of mine and somebody who is very knowledgeable on medicinal plants. And I think one of the things we're going to talk about that's really interesting today is how those medicinal plants are abundant within Missouri, within your home communities, and then the intersections of how we can relate that with indigenous activism, with also different ways that we can see it within urban communities and rural communities as well. A couple of logistical notes before we jump into the conversation. Our raffle will be next week. We will be joined by Dr. Kim Kleiman, who will be talking about place-based learning, continuation of what I talked about last week. And then that's where we will do our first raffle. So we're doing nothing this week. We'll do the raffle again next week. Again, check out our stuff on YouTube. We're posting all this stuff every week that we're doing it up onto YouTube, and then we'll also start an archive on the website with these videos as we continue. I believe we're in our 13th or 14th episode, and so again, thank you to everyone who's been a special guest, who's shared their wonderful knowledge about our communities, about things that are incredibly important within those communities, and how we can engage with those in a new way and in a genuine and empathetic way. So let's get into Jenna. Jenna, would you mind giving us a little intro about yourself, about the work that you're doing right now, and what's in the future for you?
Yeah, I am from Springfield, Missouri, which is where I'm hailing from now, and I am currently studying international studies and French for my bachelor's degree. And I have a great passion for agriculture and food insecurity. And most recently, I was certified as a full spectrum doula. So those are a few of my interests, and that's me.
Great. And I'm so happy that you're here on the interview. And before we go into talk a little bit more about medicinal plants, would you mind expanding a little bit about what you do as a full spectrum doula? And the training that you went through, and perhaps how it can be, intersected with some of the works within marginalized communities and urban communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a training through Jama Birth Village, which is in Ferguson, and it was started by a woman named True Kelman, and she was the first certified Black midwife in Missouri, and she works to train and educate other women of color to be birth workers, because there's a huge disparity in our country between the birth experience that white women have and the birth experience that women of color have, or birthing people of color have. And so the role of a doula has been shown to really improve those statistics, and so it's really important for birthing people of color to be able to have birth workers that look like them, and so that's something that True is really passionate about, and not only trains women of color but people like me to be aware of the injustices that there are in our maternal health care system, and to help close those gaps. So.
Thank you. I didn't give you a heads up about that one in our conversations, but I think it's very important, so thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Let's go into plants. Let's talk about your knowledge on medicinal plants, but let's start out with just an intro for maybe somebody who doesn't know what a medicinal plant in its broad spectrum is. What is a medicinal plant, and why is it really important within our communities?
Yeah, so medicinal plants are plants that have any kind of property that can aid or alleviate any kind of medical issue or ailment, and it's a really broad kind of world of knowledge, and it's one that's not researched a ton, not just barely touched the surface of people understanding what plants can do. There's a statistic, so as kind of a note before we begin. I dove into medicinal plants more last year for a project for a class that I did, and so I'm definitely not an expert on this. You are very kind with your words, but all the things that I'm going to talk about today are things that I've learned in the past 2 years, and there are people out there that are much more knowledgeable than I am. So take the things I say with a grain of salt. But for the project that I worked on, I ran across the statistics that 20 to 25% of all flowering plants within our bioregion can be considered medicinal. And so really, like I said, it's a broad field of knowledge that isn't tapped into yet very much. So it's kind of a vague answer, I suppose, but yeah, basically what you would think of as medicine, or what you would take as medicine in our modern kind of ways, you can apply that same kind of thinking to plants, and plants have the same properties.
Yeah, and thank you. I think one of the things that I found incredibly interesting about the research that you had in the presentation and paper you were going to write for a couple of conferences before school got thrown all in circles is how I think the implications of this can be larger in the ways of looking at how our healthcare system interacts with different communities in different ways. And this is a certain healthcare system in a way of looking at indigenous activists, indigenous knowledge, and looking at how medicinal plants interact with communities as a whole through healthcare.
With a big way to look at it, but you can also look at it through folk knowledge and medicinal practices that have been passed on through indigenous communities, and you really there's sort of this rhetoric that goes along with both of those sides of the spectrum, that folk knowledge is kind of considered as kind of aloof and not taken very seriously, whereas once a medicinal plant is researched and utilized for modern medicine, then it's kind of official, which is this really interesting way to go about the conversation, and it really has these kind of drastic implications on who we consider to be knowledge creators and knowledge holders, and who gets to say what is medicinal and what is not, and it's a really interesting kind of conversation that comes out of that.
I agree. I think it's a very interesting conversation, and there is a really broad spectrum. I think you're right of touching on what is a medicinal plant. What would be a couple of examples that you would bring up of things within Missouri that are perhaps classified as medicinal and their properties that might be beneficial for humans?
Yeah, the first things I think of is elderberry is there's an elderflower and elderberry plant, and it's widely thought of as it's used to it's used for immunity against the common flu. So it's been really popular lately with the coronavirus. And so that's one example where you can go to a local Harvest grocery store in St. Louis and get elderberry syrup, and that's that comes from a plant, and it has it's believed to have medicinal properties. And that's another thing that kind of goes with that knowledge system is herbalism compared to the FDA regulated drugs that you would get at Walgreens is not. Herbalism is not regulated by the FDA, so you have to, anytime you run across an herbalist or herbal products, they will always have a disclaimer that the herbalists themselves cannot give you actual medical advice, and you have to seek advice from a certified provider. And again, that really kind of diminishes the amount and the depth of knowledge that herbalists have, because it takes a lot of training to become an herbalist and a lot of knowledge And that's another thing they'll tell you is, don't go picking plants and eating them unless you really know your stuff. So herbalism, herbalists really do have a lot of knowledge, but in a way, because they're not regulated by the government, then it's diminished.
Thank you. I think another thing that comes to mind for me is like honeybees, right? And how impactful honey can have on like systems in the ways of pollen or allergies or seasonal allergies, and how that can be natural way as well. And another example of that, I would like to talk a little bit about the intersections of this and the larger picture, to where medicinal plants and practices can be incredibly beneficial to the individual, but perhaps in the ways of looking at food deserts in urban communities and marginalized communities. How can a larger practice in agriculture and also looking at medicinal plants sort of be crossed over within this way?
Yeah, it's interesting because we get our herbalism knowledge, and it comes from indigenous folk knowledge, but then just from observing the kind of the herbalist realm today, there's like lots of herbalists on Instagram, and people who are being certified as herbalists, and who have started companies of herbalism, and a lot of that is no longer coming from indigenous peoples. It is coming from people who have picked up an interest in it and studied it, and are well versed in it, but again, that knowledge isn't indigenous to them, and so now you see this kind of disparity between who is able to interact with and afford those ways of medicine, and it's often not the indigenous peoples who originally held that knowledge.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a current stereotype that I perhaps hold and know exists within our communities of, organic is more expensive. Organic is definitely something that falls in the realm of being a privilege to engage in fresh foods and to organic foods and the foods that were, raised in a sustainable manner, that we all want to participate in these things, but it is, you have to have the financial means in order to participate in those things. And so quite often it, in that same way, disproportionately affects communities in the health of fresh foods, but the availability and the accessibility of those fresh foods. Where would be your thoughts in that realm, and then how do you think we could engage with that in a new way, perhaps?
Yeah, no, I think what you said is exactly right, and it's it's the same thing for herbalism, but you can in terms of engaging with that disparity and trying to improve it. Jama Birth Village, which I trained with for my doula training. They have a herbal garden there, and they source plants, and they've started an apothecary themselves, and they're reaching out to communities who are marginalized and communities who don't normally have access to those kinds of things, and they're making it more normalized again back in those communities. So things like that, community-based models that come from the communities, that's something I admire about True. And their organization is, she's from Ferguson, and she works from her own experiences, and she works with, birthing people in her community, and that's why she really has, a kind of model that really works, because it's not like this savior thing. It's coming, authentically, and it's working.
Yes.
So.
Thank you. Can you talk to us a little bit about ethnobotany? And I know that was a portion of your presentation, and I am, still a little bit unfamiliar with it. Can you give us a broad overview of what you mean by that term, ethnobotany?
Yeah, ethnobotany was a term I stumbled across and had never heard about when I was doing my project, and it is essentially, technically it's the field of study that analyzes the ways that Indigenous people manipulate plant materials and the cultural context that they're used. And basically what that means is it's the study of people and their relationship with plants. So it's a really interesting field, and it incorporates folk traditions and Indigenous knowledge because of the historical connection that Indigenous people have with the land, and because it is such a cultural thing for Indigenous communities.
And this must tie in very well with the conversation around medicinal plants, because I know one of the issues that comes across a lot of times within Indigenous communities is land usage and water usage, of how those are divvied out, how we see land usage and land property, and how it sometimes conflicts from a Western view, from an Indigenous view, from either First Nations in Canada or Native American tribes within the United States, and down even further into Latin America. How can you see this idea of ethnobotany playing into the role of land usage with agriculture and with medicinal plants?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, part of the first issue I think of in terms of land usage, historically, in order to be able to utilize and have a relationship with your land, that comes over a long period of time where you build that relationship. So once, when Indigenous peoples and communities are taken out of their land and put in a different context, they lose all of that knowledge. So that's partially where, you've seen a loss of those knowledge systems. And then on top of that, like you said, with agriculture and food deserts, one of the things that can actually be really, so there's two ways to interact with medicinal plants. You can, what's called wild crafting, where you go and you forage from the wild, basically. And then you can also grow your own. So those are two different ways you can interact with them. And, growing your own is a good way to, understand what's around you and be able to interact with those native plants, and then also incorporate them into your own environment. So both of them are good ways, but you see with wild crafting, you have traditional knowledge, which is knowledge of sustainable harvesting. And that's something that if you, there's kind of becoming this sort of craze for herbalism, and if you aren't educating yourself on all of the realms, which includes being able to sustainably harvest, then you run into problems with that, with depletion of plants in your area and things like that. So there are issues in lots of different areas.
Yes, there are. And sometimes with all those issues, it can seem like such a large topic for us to, tackle, especially as individuals, to where we rely on our systems and our communities, sometimes tackle these larger institutionalized issues. But I think we can see very clearly right now that it requires a lot of individual action to see these systems change in ways that we believe is more accessible to all. How are some ways that we as individuals or as small communities, small pockets of people, can interact with this idea of sustainable agriculture, with this idea of medicinal plants, with the idea of land usage and food deserts? What is one way that we can act right now?
Go dig in the dirt. One of the ways that I've grown a passion and learned more throughout my life is personal relationship building with plants. So you go on a hike or you go on a walk and you're able to identify a plant that's on the ground beside you, and that's it just changes your mindset. And I think that's where we have to start with creating change in our communities, is being able to have a fresh perspective and a mindset that incorporates those changes. And so for me, the first way that you can do that is to build a relationship with the ground. and a great way to do that is to have a garden or, you know, go for a hike and download an app that can help you identify plants. And it's a fun way too, and it's a way that is interactive. And if you're growing edible things, then it produces a harvest for you at the end too. So it's a good. I think that's where you should start.
And I would agree as well. I'm really glad you said that, and I think that, you know, one of the things that we really want to hold at the forefront of what we're discussing right now as an organization is Black Lives Matter, is marginalized community, is how Black communities exist within systems of oppression. And I think that this has intersection with this issue that's going on right now within our community because of issues of accessibility to fresh food, to more organic, to vegetables and fruits at a more accessible rate for marginalized communities. And this is one way that we can engage and continue to break down those systems of oppression, those systems of racism that exist within our current community, just based on food systems and agriculture. So, Jenna, you're the person that I learned that from, and I appreciate you talking to us about that.
Thank you, so.
I want to give you a space to talk about anything you want. It's something I always offer to each of the guests that we have in Bridgecast. So is there anything that you'd like to talk about now to our Bridge Builders community?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to highlight something that you just said was, you said the word intersectional, or intersectionality, and I think that's why I really love, everything that we just talked about, and then that's why I really love environmentalism, because you can't look at environmental justice without looking at feminism. You can't look at feminism without looking at racial justice. You can't look at racial justice without looking at other kinds of social justice, and it all works together. Food is something that unites us all. We all have to eat, and our food comes from the ground, and so I think that's why I'm so passionate about food insecurity and access to, like you said, access to nutritional food, because if we don't, if we can't nourish our communities first, then we can't change their situations, and we can't improve the ways that they're marginalized and the access that they do have to equal opportunities and justice. So I think it's so important.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for joining us. I think your insights are incredibly valuable going forward with how we look at long-term change within our community, because I've been seeing a lot of posts, and I think that that's very powerful, that says that, just because these 2 weeks have passed doesn't mean that Black Lives Matter has stopped, right? We have to continue to engage in different ways, and sometimes it's as simple as planting a garden, but I believe enacting change comes at looking at the large spectrum of intersectionality. So thank you, Jenna. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who watched today, and we'll post this up on YouTube, so if you're watching this later, power to you, and I'm glad that you're joining us. Join us again next week for Dr. Kim Kleinman talking about place-based learning. Bye.